Welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Vault Azure Auth. Vault is a popular secrets management tool that helps organizations securely manage sensitive data. Azure Auth is a Vault authentication method that allows users to authenticate with Vault using their Azure credentials. To get started with Vault Azure Auth, you need to have a Vault instance and an Azure account. First, you need to configure Azure as an authentication method in Vault. This involves creating an Azure authentication backend in Vault and configuring the necessary settings such as the Azure Tenant ID, Client ID, and Client Secret. Once the Azure authentication backend is configured, you can then configure the authentication method to use Azure Active Directory credentials. This involves specifying the Azure resource and the permissions required to authenticate with Vault. To authenticate with Vault using Azure Auth, users need to have an Azure Active Directory account and the necessary permissions to access Vault. When a user attempts to authenticate with Vault, they are redirected to the Azure login page where they enter their Azure credentials. If the credentials are valid, Azure redirects the user back to Vault with an authentication token. Vault then verifies the authentication token with Azure and grants access to the user if the token is valid. The user is then authenticated with Vault and can access the necessary secrets and resources. Best practices for implementing Vault Azure Auth include using a service principal to authenticate with Azure, limiting the permissions granted to the Azure authentication backend, and configuring audit logging to monitor authentication events. In summary, Vault Azure Auth is a powerful authentication method that allows users to securely access Vault using their Azure credentials. By following the steps outlined in this guide, you can configure Azure Auth in Vault and provide secure access to your organization's secrets and resources.